So our final paper is by Sine Halkjelsvik Bjordal. She's a PhD candidate. Well, she's just defended her PhD, successfully so is the real truth behind that sentence. Only a couple of weeks ago, on stave churches in Norwegian tradition. At the moment, she's particularly interested in the connections between different forms of knowledge and different forms of time, natural history in the 18th century and histories of knowledges in general. So Sine, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Let me share my screen. So can you hear me and see the right screen?
Yes.
I just have to organize my windows here. Okay. Yes, okay. For several reasons, I will not present a fully developed argument, but what I will do is to present some thoughts about what I have called the lifetimes and mind times of natural histories. And I have to say that my presentation feels a bit out of place after Eric's and Brita's interesting presentations. I wish I had heard these before I wrote mine. Anyway, when preparing this paper, I realized at some point that I had mixed up the order of words in the conference title. I thought I was writing a paper not on the material life of time, but on the material time of life. And I know this sounds like more or less the same thing, but it isn't. The times of life are conceptually not the same as the lives of time. The material time of life put life in the middle of our attention. The material life of time, on the other hand, implies that time is the main object of study. My object of study was supposed to be natural history writing in the 18th century. And none of the 18th century naturalists had time as their object of study. Natural history, Historia Naturalis, was all about life on Earth in all its different forms. As is beautifully shown here in the title of Erik Pontoppidan's The Natural History of Norway, containing, quote, a particular and accurate account of the temperature of the air, the different soils, waters, vegetables, metals, minerals, stones, beasts, birds, and fishes, together with the dispositions, customs, and manner of living of the inhabitants, interspersed with physiological notes from eminent writers and transactions of academies. Time has in fact even been said to be non-existing in the naturalists' works, as Pomata and Siraisi has shown in their work on the early modern concept of historia. I'll read the whole thing. The early modern historia seriously challenges our assumptions about nature and culture as separate fields of inquiry. It forces us to realize that just as the early modern notion of nature was widely different from ours, so did the early modern notion of historia vary in fundamental ways from what we now call history or culture. Early modern natura and historia were not antithetical terms, nor were the boundaries between them drawn as we draw them now. History meant primarily a description with little, if any, reference to temporality. In the 18th century, however, something happened with natural history, or maybe even several things. In a text translated as Structures of Repetition in Language and History, available in the anthology Sediments of Time on Possible Histories, the historian Reinhard Koselleck talks about how, in the 18th century, a historicization of Historia Naturalis happened. As the temporal status of all natural sciences investigating the cosmos changed, Koselleck writes, Historia Naturalis transformed into natural history. In his text, Koselleck is interested in human history and how the historical nature of the human being is located, quote, between constant repeatability and durable innovation. The question is, Koselleck says, how we can analyze and represent the sediments and mixtures of both repetition and innovation in human history, end of quote. The singularity of events, Koselleck claims, is conditioned by what he calls structures of repetition. And he continues in his text to, quote, survey structures of repetition that are staggered at varying depths. A lot of things could be said about Koselleck's text, but a very interesting part of the text is where Koselleck talks about the structures of repetition that he calls extra-human conditions of our experience, that is cosmos, nature. This is also the part where he writes about natural history. He writes, and here's the whole quote, "Up to the 18th century, this cosmos, whether conceived of as created or eternal, was considered to be stable, such that temporally enduring laws could be derived from it or read into it. Of course, with the historicization of the traditional study of nature, historia naturalis, and its transformation into natural history, beginning with Buffon and Kant, the temporal status of all natural sciences investigating the cosmos changed. Cosmology, physics, chemistry, biology, and likewise anthropology all need their own theories of time in order to correlate individual hypotheses about courses of events with relevant structures of repetition accurately and adequately." He also refers to Herder's, for some people very well-known quote about times, where Herder, among other things, says in the English translation, "My pulse, the pace or flight of my thoughts, is no measure of time for others. The course of a single river, the growth of a single tree, is no meter of time for all rivers, trees, and plants. There thus exists, one can actually and boldly state it, in the universe, infinitely many times at the same time." Why am I talking about this? Well, for some time now, I have been obsessed not only with 18th century natural histories as such, but also with a certain type of 18th century literature where natural history played an important role, the topographical or chorographical literature in this period. For some reason, the topographical genre proliferated in 18th century Denmark, Norway, but it was also a genre in use in England, Germany, France, and other countries, although in slightly different forms. A topography was often written by a local clergyman or a civil servant, and it was a description of a particular place or region, focusing on more or less everything that can be described, as we also saw in Pontoppidan's Natural History of Norway. Animals, plants, agriculture, fish, antiquities, chronicles, farmers and their customs, fossils, legends, stones, weather, herbs, and so on. In other words, what was described also in this literature was all sorts of life. There are, however, some really interesting time things going on in these life-oriented topographical texts. In my abstract for this presentation, I wrote something about entanglement of lifetimes and mind times, and this I have to explain, I think. So, yes, I'm part of the Lifetimes project in Oslo, and the concept of lifetimes has a particular meaning in this context, or actually several meanings. There is, in fact, no common understanding of the term in the project. So in this presentation, I do it very simple, and I use the concept of lifetimes with a hyphen with the following meaning. Every entity in the universe has a proper lifetime and a rhythm of change. Every form of life, non-organic included, is always also a lifetime. And this is what Herder and Koselleck talk about. What I will argue is that exactly because the topographers in the 18th century was obsessed with life, they consequently also had to deal with time in the form of lifetimes. And this had some profound effects on what I have called the mind times of the 18th century. I could have called it something else, historical time or something like that, but by mind times, I mean very anthropocentric and very general, the many temporal relations in the world and between different life worlds, humans as social and cultural beings conceptualize, consciously or less consciously. That the knowledge created by topographers and other naturalists in different ways influenced 18th century mind times is in accordance with Koselleck's and other researchers' claims about the transformation of historia naturalis and the historicization of nature. But one thing is the well-known big names, Buffon, Kant, Herder, and so on. Their works, among others, clearly had fundamental impact on how different lifetimes became entangled with disciplinary mind times in both good and not so good ways, shaping also 19th and 20th century knowledge practices. But how did this happen more concretely in the 18th century? How did a civil servant in Denmark, Norway, handle the different lifetimes he explored in his region? How did he relate temporally to the knowledge he produced and the nature he saw? Did he read Buffon or Herder? What mind times were available for him? What is interesting in the topographical literature in the 18th century is a seemingly oscillation in life and mind time entanglements. In the text written by local clergymen and civil servants in the outskirts of Norway, or by other more or less educated non-professional naturalists other places in Europe, you can find small traces and hints of the more overarching and general processes of historicization and disciplination of nature in this period. In some of the texts, you even see that they struggle a bit. You find these interesting combinations of different forms of knowledge and temporal relations, sometimes just lined up next to each other in different chapters, but in other cases, they are explicitly aligned and tied together, as for instance is the case in a small text about antiquities written by the clergyman Hans Ström late in the 18th century. He writes, among other things, the objects known as antiquities are usually not left out of physical topographical descriptions, as they really belong to nature, understood in a broad sense. The antiquities portray the ancient people's customs and ways of thinking, which again very much depended upon the natural condition of the land. Here, Hans Ström connects human history to earth history in a very interesting way, not seen in many of the earlier topographical texts, but definitely seen in later art historical texts, for instance. We also find topographical descriptions with titles like a geographical, historical, and economical physical antiquarian description of Bringstrup and Sigersted parishes by Ringstedt, with a tragic tale of these parishes' first inhabitants and people concerning their lives, destiny, and sad incidents. I apologize, my rather bad translation here. Anyway, here we also see some interesting connections being made between forms of knowledge and life forms, implying certain temporal relations between lifetimes, tale times, and historical times. Many writers, especially at the beginning of the 18th century, also had problems with telling what was nature made and what was human made. That is, what was a product of time and what was a product of hands. The cultural historian Anne Eriksen has described this thoroughly in a book about topographers and their conceptions of the past. Piles of stones and potholes, is it craftsmanship, is it human history, or is it nature and the result of the wear and tear of time? Another temporally interesting aspect with these texts are how the knowledge itself, the gathering of these specific types of knowledge, entail a specific set of mind types. Even in texts where the different lifetimes are not explicitly tangled together, and even if some of the writers clearly have no developmental, that is historical, conception of nature or culture, they still have an idea of the development. The knowledge they gather are gathered with a purpose. They want to make practical use of it. They want to improve and utilize what they consider the country's natural resources. Some of them are scrutinizing remains from former times or writing chronicles about former kings and great men, but their knowledge is, in the end, all about the future. But many of the topographical texts are also tightly connected to the past in other ways. The topographers reproduce old scholarly knowledge found in texts written in earlier centuries. Even if empirical knowledge derived from the direct involvement with the many lifetimes on Earth was an ideal for many, a long textual tradition formed an important part of the knowledge base for 18th century topographers and naturalists. The topographical descriptions then were what I like to call bundles of times. They were bundles of lifetimes and mind times, bundles of futures, pasts, and presents. When diving into these topographical texts, what I was looking for, or what I plan to look for, is all the different and non-standardized ways these topographers and naturalists combine, define, tangle, and untangle all sorts of times. The only problem here now is that I never got the time to actually read all the texts I wanted to read, so I have no exciting results to present yet. But I am convinced that they are out there in these manifold texts. The topographical literature has also made me really curious about and interested in the relationship between knowledge and time in general. I have become interested in the connections between knowledge production, knowledge dissemination, and time relations. How do we relate to lifetimes in our research on time? And how do these relations shape our mind times? What kind of lifetimes and mind times and their entanglements do our historical or not historical time research make possible? Hopefully this is also something we can discuss. Thank you.